Danielle Tudor, who was attacked by the so-called Jogger Rapist Richard Gilmore when she was 17 in 1979, is with us this morning. Gilmore, by the way, admitted to sexually assaulting 9 women in the late 70s, early 80s. He's up for parole again. And Danielle, along with another victim, Colleen Kelly, testified at his last parole hearing. Won't this time around. Danielle, what was your reaction when you found out your voice will not be heard this time?
Well, it was pretty much a shock to both Colleen and I, because we got the same paperwork as we got 2 years ago, and so we never even thought that it was an issue to be able to testify this time at the hearing. So we pretty much have come to the conclusion that that is not probably going to change. So Colleen and I both, will be submitting our testimony via letter, and basically about the only avenue that we have now, it ends up in the court of public opinion. So we are relying heavily on people to respond to the Board of Parole regarding their opinion as far as letting him out on parole. Those emails and calls do make a difference to them.
You were allowed to testify during the last hearing in 2008. What is the explanation given to you as to why you can't this time?
Well, the explanation that we were given was actually in an email with a lot of OARs, which are the rules and regulations that they follow. And after the last hearing 2 years ago, within 6 months, they rewrote some of those. And by doing that, the definition of victim has changed somewhat. And so under those new guidelines, Colleen and I, and unfortunately, all the other victims of Richard Gilmore outside of Tiffany Eden do not qualify as a victim under their new regulations.
They had a work-study group a few years ago trying to make the parole process more victim-friendly. Obviously, you feel that's not the case.
No, we don't feel that that is the case. If anything, we feel like it's just taken a huge step backwards with the parole system. At our last hearing, Mr. Gilmore himself even whined and complained about the fact that other inmates blamed him because of our case. More victims were showing up to parole hearings to keep them in jail.
Gilmore now says he's a new man, he's a Christian, he's ready to change his life. Do you believe he will ever reach a point where he should be released back into society?
Unfortunately, whether I believe that or not isn't going to make a huge difference. He will eventually be re-released back into society. There's going to be no way to get around that. Our best hope is that we can keep him actually in prison as long as we can, and that's why Colleen and I, are fighting to keep him there, because it is the safest thing and the best thing that can happen for the public at large.
So we know you're a victim. The parole board does not recognize that at this point because your case was not prosecuted. Tell us what it's been like to live all these years with that in your background, how it's impacted your life.
I think any victim of this type of violent crime would tell you it has things that will stay with you for the rest of your life, and you can never get away from it. And for me, my biggest issues are security and feeling safe in my home and having to take precautions that make you feel like you actually are going to be safe. And I would think that any victim of this type of crime goes through the same thing. And not all victims can actually speak about it like Colleen and I can, and we don't take that for granted. We know that there are a lot of women out there that experience this that can't talk about it and remain silent.
Through the media attention you and Colleen are now getting, do you believe the parole board might have reason to change its rules again to allow you to testify in the future?
I hope they do. Let's put it that way. I really hope they do. Colleen and I feel like every time we go through this, we're the ones that are on trial and have to provide the burden of proof as to why he should still stay in there. And it should be Gilmore that has to provide the burden of proof as to why he should get out, but it doesn't seem to work that way.
Danielle Tudor, thank you for talking to us this morning. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Now, Danielle and another victim, Colleen Kelly, have testified at Gilmore's parole hearings in the past. At his next hearing next week, they won't be allowed to do so due to a rule change. Let's find out more about that from the Parole Board's Executive Director, Jay Scroggin, joining us on the Morning Update. Why won't these women be allowed to testify, Jay?
Well, first and foremost, the Parole Board wants to make it very, very clear that people like Ms. Tudor are victims. We do recognize them as victims. They have suffered a heinous crime at the result of Mr. Gilmore, and the Parole Board wants to hear from these people. We think that it's important that they do have a voice and that they are heard. This particular administrative rule regarding victims only has to deal with who can make a public statement verbally at the hearing. And this is in response to the victims legislation which passed in February of 2010, in which the victim is only recognized by those who are directly impacted as a result of the crime that is being considered by the Parole Board that day. So therefore, our rules were drafted following this legislation and following the last hearing on Mr. Gilmore, where they were able to testify. And our rules were drafted to stay consistent with the victim legislation by the Oregon State Legislature. And our rules actually broaden the definition of who can testify so long as they meet that definition. We now allow more family to testify, friends, relatives, anyone who can show that they were directly impacted as a result of the crime that is being heard before the board. So in Ms. Tudor's case and any of the other victims who have suffered a crime of Mr. Gilmore, they still can be heard, and we want to hear from them. And they can submit a letter to the Parole Board with questions, concerns, their feelings, and those are going to be considered by the Parole Board. They can even be made part of the official packet that will be discussed and referred upon. The Parole Board can even make questions based on some of those statements that they are going to ask. And, of course, they can show up in person to the hearing. These rules are consistent with current legislation for victims about who can speak, and that is it.
One of the purposes, though, the board's changes was to make it less traumatizing for the victims. And certainly in the case of Danielle Tudor and Colleen Kelly, even though they can submit emails or letters or whatever, it has become more traumatizing for them. That's what we're hearing from them.
And I understand that. And we certainly sympathize with their feelings and what's going on. This has been nothing but a roller coaster for these people and everyone who's been involved with the case since the early 2000s. But all that I can basically say, though, is that we now have rules that are drafted that specifically address who can speak in person and what the procedure is going to be to stay current with these rules that were enacted back in February of 2010.
I might be missing something, but it sounds like both the legislative action and the rules of the board would identify these two as victims. But what you're saying is victims who can't give oral testimony. It's hard to understand that, Jay.
It gets down to the definition, and what the victim legislation did was it identified the definition of a victim of record, basically the victim of the case that's before the board. Now, for someone like Mr. Gilmore and many other people who come before the board, they've also had crimes against other folks, but we have to rule and make our decisions, and in a case like this, we have to define who is a victim of record, which meets this statute, and also now our administrative rules, and then also who we also know is a victim who still needs to be heard. Once again, we're not saying by any means that these people weren't traumatized and don't need to be heard, but we have to stay consistent with what the Oregon State Legislature wrote as to who is defined as a victim. And by this definition, these people are not a victim of record.
Parole Board's Executive Director, Jay Scroggin, speaking to us on the Morning Update. Jay, we appreciate your explaining it to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.